once I get my screen up.
I usually start my walks a few minutes late anyway. I'm used to that, just a little.
Okay. All right, welcome everyone. We're here on February 18th, 2025, talking about 18 winter trees with our speaker, Mort Schmidt. My name is Ryan Foshi. I'm the co-chair of the Clintonville Green Team, and I'll be your operator tonight, working the Zoom and making sure that we let everybody in that joins. And but I wanted to just give a shout out to our first speaker in our winter webinar series, Suzanne Muller. We had a great discussion earlier this month on the 3rd. And then coming up is Kathy Tiffany with Backyard Columbus, I believe. Need to get more familiar myself, so I'll be there on the 10th to find out. Kathy's going to talk about creating a wildlife habitat. You can register for these at clintonvillegreenteam.org. There's other ways too, but that's the easiest. Just go to clintonvillegreenteam.org, find these right there and register. Where did that go? I'm just trying to make sure everybody gets in. And there are some people trying to get in. Thanks. So yeah, I'll need to keep an eye and let people in from the waiting room. But one more announcement real quick is about Columbus Arbor Fest. So here at the Clintonville Green Team, we got a great group of folks. And one thing that we do is throw this festival. Last year was our first year. I think it was great. I'm excited everyone had a good time.
Over 2,000 people on your first time.
Yeah, that's right. But it took a lot of work and we had a great team to pull all that together. And so we're going to do it again next year or this year, August 23rd. That's a Saturday. And it'll be a little longer, 12 to 5 is what we're going for this year. So check that out. We have a new website just for that, columbusarborfest.com. You don't need to register for that like we do with the webinars, but that's that. And then I'm just going to switch our view here to share Mort's presentation and turn it over to you, Mort, but I might need to click and let people in.
It'll be fine. Thank you, Rick. I guess I'll make an announcement myself. I will be co-leading a tree ID walk at Three Creeks Metro Park on Sunday at 2 with Ranger Scott Felker. And we'll be meeting at the confluence area. So if you're interested, you don't need to sign up. Just show up at 2 o'clock on Sunday, Three Creeks. So I'm not an arborist. I have no formal training in trees. I'm a retired geologist, but like most geologists, I love science and the outdoors, and I follow several generations of woodworkers, so a love for trees comes naturally to me, I guess. And I can answer a lot of questions. Various questions about native trees, etc. And I have a lot of interest in how they were used. I won't get into that in great depth. But if you have questions about what's eating my tree, I probably won't know. I have a little half acre of my own. I've planted over 20 native trees, so I've got a little woods back there, and I tried to plant natives that would be happy back there, but if they're not, I plant something else. I'm not real knowledgeable in pruning and treating and all that. I like them in their more natural state. But if you want to ask me a question about that, you can try it. You might be disappointed. So, winter trees. I find winter trees especially interesting. It'll make your nature walks far more interesting in the winter. You'll realize there are a lot of things to look at. It's not just brown on white snow. I find historically winter tree ideas interesting because, the settlers, when they were here hundreds of years ago, most of them were not lumberjacks. Most of the people cutting down, harvesting trees were not lumberjacks, they were farmers. They didn't have crops to tend in the winter. They had snow that they could haul their heavy loads over in a sleigh. That was a lot easier than pulling them over a muddy road. The sap is down on the roots. You get a head start on your drying. So winter was a good time to cut down trees. They had to know bark, maybe buds. Even buds are hard on a tall tree. So I go a lot by bark, but I like the winter idea. And there are a number of different traits that you can recognize them by. So let's get into it here. I will very likely tell you some things you don't know. I kind of like to mess with you a little bit, I guess, at the beginning. And I'll just start out with one of the basics here. What is a tree? Well, definitions vary, and I say this all the time. Nature doesn't care about our classification schemes. We have different definitions. There isn't a single definition for a lot of things, so there's not a single classification for a lot of things. Most people agree pretty well on the definition of a tree, but you have to be a little bit flexible. It's a woody perennial. This is according to the USDA Forestry Service. It should be 13 feet or more high at maturity. It's 3 inches in diameter at breast height, and it has a single trunk. Now, already we have a contradiction here. This tree that this handsome fellow is leaning on, that's my twin brother. He is leaning on a river birch, which characteristically comes up with multiple trunks. Good chance some of you have it in your yard. It's a popular landscaping tree because of the papery bark and the interesting shape. Lots of trees will come up with multiple trunks if you cut it down and let it come up from shoots. But normally from seed, they'll come up just with a single trunk. But the river birch is an exception. It'll get to be 80 feet tall, and they make flooring and furniture, etc., out of it. So is it just a really big shrub? Well, you've got to be a little bit flexible. Nature doesn't care about our classification scheme, but I'm calling it a tree. Once you've determined you've got a tree, your next question will be, is it a conifer or is it a non-conifer? There on the left, I've got some eastern white pines. Those are obvious conifers. And on the right is a nice big sugar maple, an obvious non-conifer. But some of them aren't. Ginkgo, good chance you've seen ginkgo. There's some good sized ones at the Park of Roses. It's a popular landscaping tree. This isn't one of my 18 because it's not native to Ohio. They come from China. But surprisingly, perhaps ginkgo is a conifer because we classify things not on the basis so much of leaves and needles. This doesn't have needles like most of the conifers. It has a leaf, but leaves are secondary. The classification scheme is based primarily on fruits and flowers, and that's because when Carl Linnaeus set up the classification scheme for plants a couple of hundred years ago, he determined that it was probably more important to concern ourselves with fruits and flowers because you have to have those to reproduce. And now, hundreds of years later, we have DNA evidence that shows, yeah, he was on the right track. Generally, the things with the most similar fruits and flowers are the most closely related genetically. So then what makes ginkgo a conifer? Is that it's a gymnosperm. It's a naked seed. A gymnasium is traditionally where people got naked when they worked out. And of course, sperm is seed. So it's a naked seed. It isn't obvious looking at it, at least not to me as a non-botanist. But what makes this a conifer, what makes it a gymnosperm and therefore a conifer, is that the seed is not formed inside of an ovary. That would make it a fruit. And a fruit is something that a flowering tree has that contains a seed, not even just a tree necessarily, but a dandelion seed would be a fruit. They don't have to be something you'd want to eat or carry in your lunch, whatever. But on a conifer, the equivalent of a fruit is a cone, even though they don't necessarily look like cones. That ginkgo thing there, sometimes I casually call it a fruit, but more strictly speaking, because it's a gymnosperm, a conifer, that is a cone, that apricot looking thing. So,
One second.
okay. So there we are, ginkgo, a conifer because it is a naked seed that the seed was formed outside of an ovary. Okay, so we're going to get to the Ohio things though, and most of them will be more obvious. Conifers or non-conifers. So I'll start with eastern white pine. You might consider anything to have needles and cones like this to be a pine, but that's not the case. Pines are just one group within the conifers. And you can see here, if you look on the left, these needles are in bundles of 5. Pines, think of packets. The needles are in bundles of 2, 3, or 5. and there's a little fascicle sort of thing wrapped around the base of the needles, holding them together in a bunch. Eastern white pine is easily recognizable because it's got a bundle of 5, as do the other white pines. The needles are about 3 inches long, soft, wispy, and they've got this long cone here, about almost the length of my hand, rather hard and relatively skinny. So you can remember the white pines generally, but including the eastern white pine. Think of the 5 letters, WHITE. If you count 5 needles, it's in the white pine group. White pine is interesting historically. It's been in Ohio for hundreds of years. And questionably, some people believe maybe the natives brought it into this area, and it might not have been native quite down this far, but it's been here for hundreds of years, centuries, an awful long time in any case. It's very important to us historically, to the US historically, because when the English were here and we were still a colony, or a bunch of colonies, the English were salivating over all these huge white pines. British had cut down, and Europeans generally had cut down most of their big trees, and they thought these would make perfect ship masts. So they marked all of the large eastern white pines with a broad arrow mark. That's a broad arrow mark on the right side there that they would make with 3 slashes of the hatchet. Now, this is a broad arrow mark on a cannon that was recovered from a shipwreck from around the time of the Revolution. But you'll find that on a lot of British things, at least from that period. And they would make their mark on the large eastern white pines, and they told the colonists, you can't cut these down. This is the property of the crown. The colonists resented it. They cut them down anyway. And just to mess with the British, they put broad arrow marks on all kinds of other trees. So it became a symbol of resistance. The pine tree became a symbol of resistance. And that's why a lot of the early battle flags from the Revolutionary War, the earliest American coin, the pine tree shilling, and still today, a couple of the state flags, including Vermont here, have the eastern white pine as a symbol. It was a symbol of resistance. Here's another tree emblematic, specifically to Ohio, and of course, that's the Ohio buckeye. I'm not going to talk about leaves too much because after all, it's a winter ID. But it'll help if you understand the difference between a compound and a simple leaf, because that relates to the twig size. Now there on the right and left, actually, you'll notice these Ohio buckeyes have leaflets in groups of 5. So you see 5, 5, 5, 5, 5. Each of those blades are not a leaf, they are leaflets. There are 5 leaflets together on a stem, and the whole thing falls off together at the end of a year. That is one compound leaf with 5 leaflets. The reason that's important to know in the winter is because those leaves are rather large. The leaflets may not be particularly large, but together those multiple leaflets, some have, like honey locust has over 100 probably, leaflets on one big stem, actually on multiple stems. And so they have to have stout twigs to hold them up. So when you see stout twigs on a winter tree, it's probably a large leaf, maybe a big simple leaf like catalpa, but more often than not, a large compound leaf. So that'll help you recognize it. Compound leaf trees. And when I say, where was he going with that? When I say a stout twig, I'm thinking like the diameter of a wooden pencil. A slender twig is more on the order of a pencil lead, maybe a carpenter pencil or a coloring pencil, but there's quite a bit of difference in the stoutness. A wooden pencil is more typical diameter for a tree with compound leaves. Another thing that you'll use, this applies to leaves, but it also applies to branches, and that is alternate versus opposite. So there on the left is alternate. That's those twigs, and in the summer, the leaves are arranged in a way that resembles your footprints when you walk through the snow. Left, right, left, right, left, right. On the right, those are opposite. It's as if the twigs of the leaves go into the twig or the branch and come out the other side in the same place. So alternate versus opposite, alternate on the left. There's a relatively small number of trees in Ohio in the opposite group, and we refer to those as mad buck: maple, ash, dogwood, buckeye. Most of the others, the oaks, sycamore, those are alternates, and a whole lot of others. Mad buck, maple, ash, dogwood, buckeye, those are the opposites for the trees. Quite a few of the shrubs are as well. Okay, so here's buckeye. And if you look on the left, you'll see those two buds. They're rather large. A good way to recognize buckeye in the winter, it's got these relatively large orange buds. That bud is a little smaller than the end of my pinky. That central bud, that is a terminal bud. It's at the end of a twig, and coming out the side of it, next to it, are two lateral buds. And that terminal bud is going to take off on the end of it's going to grow out and get away from them. But you'll have those two lateral buds directly across from each other. On the right is a leaf scar. It's relatively large, and you can see that twig, buckeye, has a compound leaf: maple, ash, dogwood, buckeye. It's one of the mad bucks. That's a relatively large twig, not too small, too much smaller than the diameter of my finger. And there's a leaf scar on the opposite side of that twig, looks just like it. Now, if you want to get down to species level, and I don't stress this too much in the winter, species level, you can do some, others are a little harder. At the lumber yard, it's all red oak, it's all white oak, etc. They group things quite a bit. But if you want to get down to species, the Ohio buckeye, which is one you might want to know, it has this bumpy covering on the outside of the wooden looking buckeye. You know, the buckeye, the brown thing with a tan spot on it. So the Ohio State mascot is Brutus. So Bumpy Brutus. You see this bumpy covering on the buckeye, that is the Ohio buckeye, Bumpy Brutus. Also notice the leaf scar is somewhat horseshoe shaped. Where do the Ohio Buckeyes play? The Ohio State Buckeyes, they play football in the horseshoe. So you see that horseshoe shaped leaf scar, that's the Ohio Buckeye. And that's most of what we have in central Ohio. In southern Ohio, it's more common to have the yellow buckeye, which is generally pretty similar, but the husk on the outside of the buckeye is smoother, and the leaf scar is more of a stretched out semicircle. Let's see. Yep, I'm gonna go the other way. Here we go. I will talk a little bit about wood use and that kind of thing, but one thing worth knowing is that wood density and hardness go hand in hand. Buckeye is one of the softest woods, and at least they grow in Ohio. Buckeye is even softer than some of the so-called softwoods, and here's another paradox for you. When we say softwood, we're talking about conifers. When we're talking about hardwoods, we're talking about leafed trees, the non-conifers. But in fact, there's some overlap. So some of the hardwoods, like so-called hardwoods like buckeye, especially yellow buckeye, is a hardwood, but it's not a hard wood. The wood is actually softer than red cedar, which we're going to talk about later. So hardwood is generally a thing meaning leafed trees, non-conifers, but they're not necessarily hard. You can see here the hardness on the horizontal scale and the density of the tree on the vertical scale. That's a pretty good correlation. Those blue dots are all Ohio trees. I mixed in conifers and non-conifers. At the extreme upper right is the hardest commercially available wood, known as ironwood. But there are over 100 trees in the world known as ironwood that happen to be harder than the other trees around them, two of which are in Ohio and we'll look at a little later. They're not related, they're just really hard. But the ironwood, Lignum vitae, is up there in the upper right square. And the lower left square, that's balsa. You're probably familiar with balsa, which ironically is the softest commercially available wood, but it's a hardwood because it's got leaves. It's a non-conifer. But that's balsa in the lower left. But the Ohio trees are spread out there in those blue dots. All right, oak. So oak is, I mentioned fruits and flowers. Look in the right picture, look in the background. You may associate oaks, you probably associate oaks with things that look like this. This is a white oak leaf, white oak leaves. They've got they've got lobes, they've got things sticking out. They don't have a smooth margin. Here's some red oaks here, a couple of red oak leaves. This on the right looks nothing like that, and people often don't recognize it as an oak, but this is a native Ohio shingle oak. It's an oak because of the fruits. It's got acorns you see there in the background. That's what it takes to make an oak tree. Fruits and flowers are more important than leaf shape. Now you will see a lot of the leaves still on buckeyes. Still on oak trees. The shingle oak here and one or two of the others, the pin oak, tend to hold their leaves longer than most. But a good winter trait to recognize them on is the multiple terminal buds. Look there on the left. You can see 4 terminal buds. I think a 5th one broke off from the top there. I see a little bit of a scar. They have multiple terminal buds so that if critters, worms, or whatever eat the leaves and attack them sometime in the summer, they have a shot at growing some new leaves and getting through the summer and making it to the next year. So look for those multiple terminal buds on the oaks. That is not the same as this on the left with the buckeye. Those are 2 lateral buds and 1 terminal bud, but you would never see them in groups of 4 or 5. Whereas the oaks, you might see 2, 4, 5, occasionally 6 or 7 clusters. So the oaks have acorns, they have multiple terminal buds, and they tend to have persistent leaves. Anytime in the winter you see a tree with a leaf still hanging on it, there's a good chance it's oak or it's a close relative, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, white oak versus red oak. The white oak, Quercus alba, it's got long lobes, relatively long, skinny lobes, something like fingers on your hand, and rounded tips. So you can think of snowballs are round and white. So if you see the rounded tips on oak leaves, that tells you it's probably a white oak. I recognize the bark on this because it's got this shingly look, and it even somewhat resembles shagbark hickory, is one a lot of people know, but the bark isn't occurring in those long strips. And they don't come loose so much at the bottom and at the top the way shagbark hickory does. One thing that's important with bark ID is that you need to look at the entire tree, because the immature bark on a small tree or up high in a mature tree doesn't often looks very different from the mature bark down below. So I took a picture of this rather mature tree up at the branches. That's where you'll see the characteristic bark. Red oaks have pointed tips. So you can think of a knife is pointed, it's sharp. If you cut yourself, you'll see red blood. So pointed leaves there, red oak. I also associate it with ridges. At least these 2 oaks, that upper leaf is the northern red oak, and the lower leaf is the pin oak. And I don't have time to get into all the species. That would be a lecture in itself. But these 2 have ridges, and the red oak, the northern red oak, has these smooth ridges you can see on the right on the bark. And so I think of ridges red. If I see those ridges, I think of at least 2 of the red oaks, northern red oak and pin oak. Now, the important thing in the oaks, again, is not leaf shape so much. It is the fruit. I should mention here real quick, the tree there in the middle, that's a pin oak. Pin oak, you can see that's a winter picture and it's holding its leaves. The pin oaks are good at that, but you can recognize it in the winter by its shape. You can see that when you're driving on the freeway half a mile away, because they have droopy lower branches and rising upper branches. That kind of hourglass shape, very characteristic of pin oaks. But the difference botanically is in the acorns, because the white oak acorns are sweet. They're low in tannic acid. Squirrels love them, deer love them, bear. That's a big part of bear diets and where bears are. And the white oak acorns are sweet, and so they need to send out their sprouts, their roots, more or less immediately after they fall, so that they're not hauled off. They anchor themselves and they expend their energy in forming a root system. Red oaks are bitter. They have higher tannic acid, and so they can wait around until spring before they sprout. So that's the difference, is in the fruits. White oaks sprout right away, more or less. red oaks sprout in the following spring. But that's not very helpful in identifying in the field, so we go by pointed versus rounded leaf tips. The white oak, Quercus alba, and one of the others, the chinkapin oak, has shingle-like bark, whereas we have those smooth ridged bark in at least a couple of the red oaks, the red oak, northern red oak, and the pin oak. There's a difference in the lumber too. White oak on average is a little bit harder, but more importantly, it is tight. It is watertight. So when you made a barrel, if you wanted tight cooperage for like whiskey or wine or water back in the day, you'd use white oak wood and some other woods as well. But red oak is too leaky. You'd use that for slack cooperage. You'd put, back in the day, they'd put, crackers and flour and nails and other kinds of things were hauled in red oak barrels and certain others. But the reason for that is that you have little foam-like stuff in the pores of white oak called tylosis. And this foamy kind of stuff blocks water flow. It also makes it more rot resistant because white oak doesn't take up water and it doesn't get fungi in it to decay it.
Were pin oaks
So here's a close relative of acorns, of oak trees. They don't have acorns, but they're in the same family. And they have persistent leaves as well. I'm sure you recognize the smooth bark. This is the one on the left that people love to carve in. And you can see there those winter leaves hang on real well. Another good winter trait besides the bark are those buds. You'll see a little closer picture of them in just a second. But they're these orange cigar-shaped buds, and they have visible scales in them. The fruit is the beech nut, that thing in the middle with the spines on it. That is the beech nut fruit. It's about a half an inch across, not even that, maybe 3/8 of an inch. And inside of that is a small triangular nut. It's edible to people. Animals love it. And it's associated with a brand name, beech nut chewing tobacco, beech nut baby food, beech nut chewing gum. Because back in the day, farmers used to like to turn their pigs loose in the fall and the late summer, summer. They'd turn the pigs loose in the forest and they would eat beech nuts. It had a bland flavor, about like an almond, and the pigs would get fattened up and they'd have a very high quality meat. So beech nut became associated with quality. That's where the name is from. There's a bud there on the left. They get pretty good size this time of year, late in winter, and you can see the visible scales on them. What's interesting about their persistent leaves is you can see that picture there in the middle. This is very typical. They'll tend to have leaves, they'll retain their leaves in the lower part of the tree, but not the upper part of the tree. No one's exactly sure why that is, but my favorite theory for that is that the leaves make the buds less palatable to browsing animals. So the deer chew on the buds, they get all those papery leaves in with it. It makes them more prone to leave the trees alone. There's a penalty to having leaves high up in the tree in the winter because they gather snow and ice, and that could cause the branches to break. So they've evolved to keep their leaves only in the lower part, closer to where the deer browse. And so it's a very useful adaptation that way. There on the right is a beech trunk. They tend to hollow out. The light colored woods do tend to hollow out. The darker ones like walnut are typically more rot resistant. But because they're light color and they like to grow in swampier areas, they make great habitat for raccoons, owls, etc. All right, we'll do another conifer. Eastern red cedar. Here's another paradox. I keep hitting with these things. There are a number of cedars native to the United States, except that they are not actually cedars. There is no true cedar native to the Americas. Cedars are native to Asia, Africa, Europe. The so-called Eastern red cedar is actually a juniper. It's a lumber tree. Now, the Eastern red cedar is the one that blanket chests are made of. And that's a decent sized one there on the left. You might have been to, probably don't have enough to recognize it, but that mound that it's in front of, that is Serpent Mound. And the trees there on the right are in a road cut. They're hardy. They tend to be a little aggressive. Some people consider them pests. I don't. They're native. They're good for reclamation. They're used in reclaiming road cuts and landmines, not landmines, coal mines, disturbed land and that kind of thing. So they tend to be a little too aggressive, and people sometimes think, well, it makes it a trash tree, but they're native. They belong here. I'm happy with them. But here's another paradox for you. Besides that, it's not the eastern red cedar is not a cedar. It doesn't have what you think of as a cone. Those blue berries on the left, those are cones. A cone, again, is the equivalent of a fruit on a conifer, but they don't resemble cones that you normally think of. They don't really have what you'd call a needle either. They have this kind of scaly foliage, but I don't think you'd look at that and fail to recognize it as a conifer. These two, the thing in the middle and the thing in the right, are very interesting features that I look for on the eastern so-called red cedar. And this is called cedar apple rust. People who keep apple orchards hate cedars because they tend to attract a fungus, a so-called cedar apple rust. And this hard thing in the middle looks like a dimpled golf ball. It's a hard little lump, and it just kind of sits there for most of the year. But in late April, early May, at least the past couple of years, they sprout these orange tentacles, and they're really bizarre looking. They look like something from outer space or whatever, a sea anemone. And then they disappear. The orange tentacles, I don't know if they fall off or go back in. I suppose they fall off, and you have these hard lumps left there. But look for these things. They're interesting features when you're looking at an eastern red cedar. Orchardists hate these because the cedar apple rust will result in rust, rough surface on the surface of their apples, and they reduce the value, the market value of the apples. But I find it a nice tree, attractive, and again, it's what blanket chests are made of, so-called cedar chests. Okay, another non-conifer. This is one of the two ironwoods native to Ohio. It's got several common names. You can see in the middle there, it looks like somebody's flexing their muscle with a sinewy kind of look. It's got a smooth bark like beech, and it's somewhat related to beech. Some people see a bluish cast in that. I don't know about that, but it's also known as blue beech. And it is one of our two hornbeams. I said there are two ironwoods grow in Ohio. They're also both called hornbeams, but this is the American hornbeam. So I tell people they can remember Superman, the all-American guy with the big muscles. The American hornbeam is the muscle wood, like Superman, all-American muscly guy. They don't get real big. They're an understory tree. That one on the left with a fellow leaning on it there, that's about all the bigger they get. They don't get much bigger than that.
Huh.
The fruit is there on the right. It looks like it fruits. They look like a bunch of willow leaves bundled up. So that is one of the ironwoods from Ohio. There it is again on the right. They show up real well in the winter. They have a nondescript leaf. So this is one of those trees that's good to recognize by other features because the leaf doesn't look like much. But the bark, the tree trunk with that sinewy kind of look, very recognizable. There are the fruits again on the left. Most of them are gone by now, but some of them persist into the snow. So here's the other ironwood, the so-called hop hornbeam. Hornbeam is Germanic for hardwood. And you can see the fruit there on the right looks quite a bit like beer hops. I didn't see many this year. I don't know if it's because of the dryness or what. But what you'll recognize on this, that tree gets a little larger. You might see one a foot in diameter, but that's a hefty one. This one is probably about 4 inches. So you can see what I like to describe as cat scratch bark. You can see those striations, fissures, whatever you want to call them, the scratches on the bark. Those little strips are only maybe 1/4 of an inch wide. So that's what makes it recognizable. Very hard wood. The hornbeams were very useful wood. And you know, when the settlers came here, they were here with the stuff they could carry on their back, a good many of them. They didn't go carrying around a lot of metal stuff. Metal was extremely expensive. If you ever read Walden Pond, Thoreau's Walden Pond, he talks about borrowing an axe to chop down trees and build his cabin. And the guy who lent it to him was very worried about that axe because it probably cost him something in the order of a month's income. And so people learned how to make use of the native materials. The only iron that people owned in those days would typically be a gun, a knife, an axe, and a cooking pot, and not much more. So they would use this and the other ironwood, the hornbeams, to make wedges for splitting logs. It was very hard up there with hickory, but a whole lot smoother, so it would be easier to drive in. You make a crack, start a crack with your axe, and then you hammer the wedge, the ironwood wedge in with the back of the axe. They made plane bodies, wooden planes, woodworking planes, used to be made almost entirely of wood, except for the blade itself. And ironwood was a good choice for things like that because it got a lot of wear. It was rubbing back and forth over other wood, some of them pretty hard. And you wanted something smooth and that resisted wear. So they made planes, woodworking planes out of the hornbeams. Oddly, they also made cups and bowls out of them. You'd think there'd be something a lot easier to work with. But while it was still green, before it dried, the hornbeam wasn't as hard. And it didn't have much flavor and it was smooth. So it wouldn't impart flavors to their foods. And it also tended not to crack when it dried. A lot of times, if you've done any woodworking, if you've made any bowls, they have a tendency to crack as the wood dries, and the hornbeam resisted cracking. Obviously, you don't want that. You don't want cracking in a bowl or a cup. So some of the uses for ironwood. There's another on the left. That's a pretty good sized one. On the left with the cat scratch bark, the hop hornbeam, and there you can see a specimen not too far from where I'm sitting now here in Clintonville. On the lower Olentangy urban arboretum. That's worth a look. This guy has a whole lot of hops on. And going back here, you can see that's your other nondescript leaf. Nothing too much to see there, but the bark gives it away. Sycamore, another native tree. Camo is in the name. So you see this camouflage look. You can remember camo is in the name. Sycamore. That's why I capitalized CA.
Memory helps.
This is a very good example of what I was saying earlier, why you need to look at the entire tree. This camo look that you associate with sycamore is on the middle of a mature tree. Up high on that tree and on an immature tree, you'll see mostly only white, silvery looking bark. Near the base at eye level of this good sized tree on the left, it's brown and scaly. So always look at the whole tree, especially a mature tree. Now the fruits, characteristic fruits, are these so-called button balls on the right. They're about 1.5 inches across. And the only thing with a fruit that size, the only other thing around here is the sweet gum, but that's the spiky, spiny ball that you wouldn't want to step on barefoot. These are soft and they break up real easily. You can tell by your local geography, typically whether it's this or a native, this Native American sycamore or the non-native London plane tree. The plane tree, plane, P-L-A-N-E, is what the term they use for the sycamores. But when you're in the city, on your street, probably in your yard, if you have a sycamore, it's probably a London plane tree, which is a hybrid of something that grows in Europe and the American sycamore. They do that because it's more resistant to urban conditions, compressing, walking around on the soil, salt, pollution, that kind of thing. But if you're down on a river or in a wooded area, an earlier wooded area, then you're probably looking at the American sycamore. And the way you tell the difference is the native sycamore has this white, light colored white bark, at least in between the mottled brown spots and in the upper bark. The London plane tree that you see in the cities and the parks, it's got a more greenish, yellowish cast. And the fruits there on the right, on our native, will be hanging one per stem. On the London plane tree, I've got another picture here. Well, this doesn't show the fruits, but on the London plane tree, you'll see not all of them by any means, but you'll see quite a few where you've got 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 fruits hanging from a single stem. Those are the non-natives. That's some of the wood. Sycamore isn't used a lot for lumber because, for one thing, it tends to grow along rivers where it's hard to harvest. It's a light colored wood and it hollows out readily. And the trees were huge. They get really immense. They're and hollow, and there are descriptions, for example, from the 1800s, one in particular that could get 40 people in it, 40 adults inside the hollow tree.
What?
12 men
To
on
me.
horseback
What?
inside of the hollow tree. I've been inside of a couple. We're not that big, but we're very impressive.
Somebody
Could have
said
gotten
something
20
to
people
me. Did you see
standing
it?
out. And
Megan Robertson.
so there's the wood. If you slice it in the right direction, it's got this attractive lace
A direct
pattern. But
message.
again,
Why
it isn't
can't I
used
see it?
too much commercially. Another good feature for recognizing sycamore in the winter, besides the bark,
No, Megan
when it's
Robertson.
young, it has plain white bark, and it's not very obvious. But what it does have instead are these so-called stipules. Stipules take different forms. Some of them are thorn-like, some stipules,
See,
like
it's
on a
right there.
grapevine, the stipule, they come out where the leaves are. They come out at the leaf base. Stipules on some things like grapevines are the twisty things that wrap around things and tangle. On a sycamore, the stipule is this leaf-looking thing, but it doesn't have a stem. It looks as if the leaf was impaled directly on a twig. And these tend to be more common in the juveniles, sometimes on the older trees. So look for these stipules that, for whatever reason, hold on into the winter long after the leaves have fallen off. It also has a zigzaggy twig, and if you look closer on the left, you'll see a maroon colored pointed bud. So sycamore is a pretty easy one, even in the sapling phase, to pick out in the winter. Maples. You probably recognize most maples because most of them, at least that grow around here, have a leaf that looks like the Canadian flag, more or less. But that's not what makes it a maple. Some maples have leaves that look nothing like this. Some of them have compound leaves in groups of 3. In fact, one of the Ohio ones does, but I don't have time to get into all of them. But again, it's fruits and flowers. What makes a maple is this seed, this pair of seeds on the right. No, when you have a papery seed, or if you have a seed attached to a papery wafer kind of thing, that's called a samara, Samara. The ashes have a samara. It's a leaf at the end of a skinny papery thing. The elms have a round disc with a seed in the middle. What maples have is a pair of samaras. And so that these little helicopter things, I'm sure you played with them when you were a kid and maybe more recently. But the seeds grow in pairs and then they break off and they flutter down in the wind. That's how they disperse themselves. So the fact that this samara grows in a pair like that is what makes a maple, more important than leaf shape. Here's a red maple. In late winter, they start to bloom. And the flowers aren't something that you would put in a vase, but a flower just has to make and or receive pollen and then produce a seed. And to be a flower, then it's got to have an ovary, otherwise it would be a cone, okay? Those are the buds. These are very typical winter buds of a red maple. Actually, that may be a silver maple. They're similar, but the twigs are relatively slender. They're not like a pencil in diameter. You can see those buds, they have a bit of red color in them. It's a little hard to see against the sun, but even now you can see a little bit of red color in them. And notice the twigs come out directly across from each other. Madbuck, maple, ash, dogwood, buckeye. The twigs and the buds are coming out directly across from each other on those stems. Twigs, I'm sorry. Stems are things with leaves at the end of them. These are some later spring flowers that are turning into the little paired samaras from a red maple. Sugar maple on the left being tapped for sugar. You can tap any of the maples for sugar. The sugar maple will give you the highest concentration of sap. You know, you have to boil about 30 or 40 gallons of sap to get 1 gallon of maple syrup. The other maples are more watery. You've got to do a lot more boiling, but they all give edible maple syrup. Okay, shagbark hickory. This is one that you very likely know or think you know, but there are two very similar ones that you may not have known were different. And that's okay. It's all hickory at the lumber yard. But shagbark has this obviously shaggy bark, and it can look something like the other trees, like I mentioned the white oak bark earlier on. But look at the way it lifts up at the bottom. And a lot of the strips come loose at the top as well. Some of the other trees, the bark comes loose at the sides. Shagbark and the shellbark hickory, I'll talk about in just a second. They have buds that resemble, to me anyway, a rosebud, only gray, kind of a brownish gray. There's a shagbark hickory on the left, not one you find in farm fields real often, more of a woods tree. This is the nut. Hickory nuts are edible to people. Most of them are edible anyway. Some of them are edible. Okay, shagbark and shellbark are edible. In fact, they're very good tasting. And in fact, the pecan is a hickory that grows in more southern climates. You will see the occasional pecan growing in Ohio, but I don't think they produce fruit here. So on the left, summer ID here, but in the left there, the upper left, you see 5 leaflets attached to a stem. That is the shagbark hickory. 7 leaflets attached to a stem on the right. That is the shellbark hickory. And the nut on it is much larger, so it's often called a king nut also, shellbark king nut. That is a king nut hickory there in my hand. You can see it's really huge. It's like the size of a tangerine. The shagbark hickory nut is about half that size. And it looks quite a bit like the native walnuts, and they're related to walnuts. They both have inside them, like a pecan or like the other walnuts, they have a brain-shaped fruit, a pair of them in each of these nuts. Now, the shagbark and the shellbark nuts, you'll notice there's a groove on that outer husk, and they'll split into 4. You'll get that outer husk there in the lower right of the middle picture, and above it is the inner shell. And then you break that, and you've got the nut meat inside of it. Again, the shagbark and the shellbark are good eating. They're as good or better than pecans, but they're mostly shell and not much meat, so they're not a very useful commercial crop. The hickories, as you probably know, produce very useful wood, hammer handles, axe handles, those kinds of things. That's a very hard, shock-resistant wood with a long grain to it. So axe handles, baseball bats, if you're Babe Ruth, were made out of that. But again, because it's very hard, it's also very heavy. So not too many people would swing a hickory baseball bat, but a few people did. So that is hickory. 2 of the edible hickories. Here's one that isn't edible. Bitternut hickory gets its name for obvious reasons. Notice that the nut here is quite a bit smaller. The inner shell is not too different in size from shagbark hickory, but instead of having a hard outer husk, it's got just more of a skin on it. They don't need much protection from foragers because their taste is their protection. These will sit around until spring because nothing much wants to eat them. It's a starvation food for the squirrels and the critters, but when all the other good stuff is gone, they'll eventually get around to eating these. And you'll notice instead of grooves, they have ridges on them. That's a good way to pick out bitternut hickories. The bark is very different. The bark here has a diamond pattern, as do several other trees, but the bitternut hickory there on the left, the bark is a lot shallower and lighter color than some of the others like ash and sometimes walnut. I especially like the bitternut in winter because the bud can be mistaken for no other, at least nothing else that grows here. It's sometimes very bright yellow, sometimes more of a stone ground mustard color, but there against my red jacket there, it really shows up. None of the other trees have a bud, anything like that. And in fact, some of the guidebooks even call it the yellow bud hickory. So it's not that yellow. You might recognize some full-size trees by these cankers that form. Those are good-sized trees. Those are maybe 8-10 inches in diameter. They're not twigs. And they have this canker growing on them from any one of several fungi that attacks them. And it hurts the trees, but oddly, it doesn't seem to spread much. You'll often see just 1 or 2 trees covered with these cankers, and the bitternut hickory right next to it will be okay. So you might recognize a few on that basis. But the yellow bud, and the yellow bud is usually visible even in the summer. It'll be kind of tucked in between the leaves. So look for the yellow bud, bitternut hickory, yellow bud. All right, ash. I mentioned there's another diamond bark. There it is. A very coarse diamond pattern there on the left. Unfortunately, you don't see that much anymore because the big ash trees are dying off from the emerald ash borer. Usually when you see a large ash tree, it's going to be in somebody's yard or like at the metro parks next to the visitor center. They have to treat them to keep them alive, and you can't afford to do that to every tree in the forest. Remember madbuck, maple, ash, dogwood, buckeye. Those are your opposite twigs on the right. You see the twigs go in one side and come right out the other side of those of the branches. And I look at ash trees in the winter, I think of pitchforks. They're relatively stout twigs, more on the order of a wooden pencil in diameter, because they have a compound leaf. Typically, the green and the white ash have 7 leaflets attached to a stem. So the overall leaf is rather large. It needs a fat twig to hold it up. And opposite. I show the seeds here in the middle. The lower seed is an ash seed, an ash samara. You can see a seed at the end of a blade, and it looks something like a canoe with a handle, canoe paddle with the handle sawn off. There above it, for comparison, is a maple samara. That's half of the pair of samaras that makes maple. A real good way to recognize them in the winter, what you do see a lot, and summer, I guess, as well. The large ash trees are pretty well dying off, but the saplings are very hardy. They'll do okay for a couple of years until, for whatever reason, the emerald ash borer takes an interest in them. I'm not sure why they don't like the trees in the first couple of years, but there are a lot of saplings around, and you can tell by looking at the terminal bud at the top of the sapling or at the end of the twigs. You see this Phillips head screwdriver looking thing. So the Phillips head screwdriver, that is characteristic of the terminal bud of the ash trees. And I mentioned the woods here. Look at the way on the right. If you look at the end section, that's from a stump of a tree that was cut down probably for emerald ash borer. But you can see those large pores line up in the annual rings. So that is a ring porous wood. Ash, oak, hickory are all ring porous woods. That's why they split along the grain. Whereas some of the others like maple don't split quite as readily. Some like sycamore, you can't split to save your life. Cottonwood, you can't split. They're not ring porous, and they have other things going for them too. But that ring porosity makes them split readily. And that's very handy for firewood. You want to be able to split it along the grain. It's also useful because, the settlers and the natives before them, of course, the natives didn't have saws, they had axes, but they didn't want to have to saw a board to length if they didn't have to. They might saw it or hatchet it, hack it in the cross direction, but if they could take an axe and a wedge and split it in the long direction, it would save them a lot of work. So if they were making tool handles or a covered wagon handle, something like that, spokes for a wheel, they would want a long-grained wood like this. And with the ring porosity, they split more readily. And you can tell when you're looking at a tree stump, you see that ring porosity, it's probably ash, oak, or hickory. Diffuse porosity, I should mention, is what maple, sycamore, and a lot of the others have, where the larger pores are spread out evenly. They're diffuse, that's diffuse porosity. Okay, black walnut. Walnut is a relative of the hickories. It's got the similar fruit. It's got the two brain-shaped fruits inside of there. Now, this is not the walnut that you typically eat. That's the English walnut. The English walnut has more meat and less shell, and it's a lot milder tasting. These have a strong taste, and most people don't have a taste for it. You might see black walnut candy or something now and then. My grandparents always had it around, and as a kid, I couldn't decide if I liked it or not. It's a bit bitter, but now for nostalgia, if nothing else, I like the taste every now and then. But it's got a hard shell with a green husk on the outside of it. No grooves, no ridges the way you found in the hickories for that husk. The bark is recognizable. It can be somewhat diamond looking, and I've mistaken it for ash before, but it wouldn't have opposite twigs. It would have alternating twigs. Maple ash, dogwood, buckeye, those will have opposite twigs. These are alternating. But as it gets older, it's got this kind of blocky, dark colored bark, and the blocks are maybe 4 or 5 inches long, 1.5 to 2 inches wide. And you can often get a clue that you're walking under a black walnut tree in the winter because you look down and you see these long twigs. These stems are disposable. They're only used 1 year, at least on deciduous trees. So these stems are about 1 foot long. They had about 20, 22 leaflets on them. And leaves blow around, nuts get carried around by squirrels and critters, but nothing is very interested in the stems here. So when you're walking along and you notice a pile of stems, look up. There's a good chance you're walking under a black walnut, or at least something with compound leaves with a lot of leaflets attached to it. There are other good ways to recognize walnut, and one are the leaf scars. So this so-called monkey face is where the leaf was attached there in the middle. You see it's a heart-shaped kind of thing with a couple of eyes and a mouth or a mustache or whatever. The twig there on the left is relatively stout, something like a wooden pencil in diameter, because it's got a big compound leaf on it. And there's several monkey faces, one there at the bottom, one a little, about 1/3 of the way up, and one 2/3 of the way up. And it's got this gray, sort of pointed bud, but the gray is from little tiny hairlets if you look at it under magnification. You can also recognize walnut. You might mistake it for a couple of other trees, but if you take a young twig, preferably one that's on the ground, a dead one, and you slit it lengthwise, you'll see the chambered pith. You'll see these layer-like things going across perpendicular to the axis. But this chambered pith is believed to, at least one theory is that it controls the rate of sap flow. So that's characteristic of this, and its close relative, the white walnut, which is rather similar. They're not very common, so I won't get into that. Oh, excuse me. So I mentioned here's another tree that doesn't split. It's almost impossible to split. You can't use it for firewood, and it's very soft. Soft, so it wouldn't make for good firewood anyway. Soft woods are more air than anything, and that is the softer woods have a lot more air in them than less wood, so that it wouldn't burn hot anyway. But it has a distinctive pith, so this is another interesting trait. If you look at the cottonwood twigs, that's got a kind of a greenish bud in the winter, maybe a little bit of orange. And you can see there that section in the lower right of the middle picture looks like an area where you pushed your socks down around your ankles. If you cut through that perpendicular with a knife and then look at the end, you'll see these beautiful little star-shaped pith. So that's an interesting feature on cottonwood. Sometimes on the young twigs, you'll see 5 flattish sides to it, 5 flat sides corresponding to the 5 points of the star. They get really immense. They're one of the biggest trees that grows in the eastern US, and they grow in most of the eastern US. they'll get to 4 feet in diameter in as little as 60 years. And so people are all the time looking at these and asking, that's huge. How old do you think that is? And I'll tell them, well, it's probably younger than I am. I'm in my early 70s. They die at about 100. So a 4-foot tree is not particularly ancient. They're not the most revered wood in terms of woodworking. Again, it makes lousy firewood. You can't split it, doesn't burn hot. It is used some for wood. You can make pallets out of it. They make pallets out of about anything. And sometimes paper pulp. But like sycamore, it tends to grow along rivers and areas where it's kind of hard to get at. That's one drawback. But again, historically, it played a very important role in American history. When Lewis and Clark took their expedition up the Missouri River, they spent the first year, 1804, I think, going up the Missouri River from the St. Louis area. And they stopped for the winter with the Mandan Indians at what in the area we now call Fort Mandan. And they took a flatboat up there, which they moved upriver with poles. And I think they might have pulled it by horses anyway, mostly poling. But the water got too shallow for their flatboat. So they only used that for the first year. They sent it downriver with all the specimens, the botanical specimens, skins and furs, feathers and things they collected. They sent the flatboat downriver to St. Louis. From there, they had to go upstream in smaller boats. And the natives taught them that the cottonwood made a great dugout canoe because it was relatively soft and it's easy for me to say, but easier to hack out than a lot of trees would be. They grew very large and they don't split. That makes lousy firewood, but it makes a whole lot better wood than something that does split. So they made 6 of these dugout canoes out of large cottonwoods. They made another couple later on as they went up the Missouri River. And they even made the wheels out of slices of sycamore, since it doesn't split. If you were to make wheels to haul these things out of oak, it'd split in half in no time. But out of sycamore, they just sliced off a piece, put a hole in the middle, and they had a wheel. So their canoes that they went up to the foot of the mountains, they made those out of eastern cottonwoods. Now, when they got to the mountains, they had 600 miles, a little over 600 miles they had to traverse by horses. They couldn't use the canoes anymore there. So they buried them. I think they sank them in the river, actually. They sank them in the river anyway. They hid them so that they could use them on their return trip. But they were going by horses. That's one of the reasons Sacagawea was so valuable to them. Sacagawea, who they met at the Mandan camp, she was not herself Mandan. She was Shoshone. She was from one of the Western tribes. They knew that she would be able to bargain for horses with the Shoshone people, and they would need those horses to go over the mountains. She also showed them what they could eat. There were a lot of edible tubers and roots that she was familiar with, and they weren't. They didn't bring enough food to sustain them, and they couldn't always find things that they recognized or could hunt. But she also showed them how to feed the horses, because when they got to the mountains, sometimes the forage was covered with snow and the horses couldn't find anything to eat. Sacagawea showed them that the cottonwood bark came off readily, and if they pulled it off and took the inner bark, the horses loved it. They felt bad at first, but it turns out the horses thought it was candy or something. And so the horses subsisted on the inner bark of the cottonwood. So it was essential to the Lewis and Clark expedition. And who knows, maybe our country's outline would look something different without the cottonwood. All right, another hardwood and a much harder wood, and that is hawthorn. So these fruits on the right, they look like crab apples, and they're not too far from crab apples. They're in the rose family, and these are edible. They taste like crab apples. Those are also called haws, and there are several trees that have small fruits we refer to as haws. Well, they're just above my thumb. You'll see a long, sharp thorn. That it's got thorns, it's got haws, so it's a hawthorn. They're also called mayhaws because depending on the area, I think it's earlier, I forget if it's April I believe it's April that they flower here, but somewhere probably England, who also has mayhaws, they bloom in May. Mayflower was a symbol. They're also called Mayflower, and that was a symbol of hope. And that's where the boat, the famous boat that came here, got its name. It was a symbol of hope, named for the tree that blooms in May, at least I think in England. Now, these hawthorn fruits are edible, as I mentioned. All of the hawthorns, I believe, are edible, and they taste like crab apples. They're valuable to people in warmer climates in Mexico, Central America, Southeast Asia. They eat a lot of hawthorns because it's too warm to grow apples. The trees don't set fruits in warmer climates, but they make hawthorns into all kinds of stuff. There, by the way, on the left are a couple of the trees. You might see the red hawthorns on them. They're various in size. There are literally hundreds of species. I don't know. I don't think anybody knows all of the species. I recognize a couple of them, I think. But you see the thorns, that's all you need to recognize them. And those are pretty typical sizes there on the left. They get a little bigger, but not a lot. Excuse me, those are some of the leaves. I believe that's a cockspur hawthorn on the right. But even without the leaves, you can see those huge thorns. And notice that the thorns don't have any branches. Let's look at a tree a little later that has big, long, wild thorns, but they branch out. You might see some spikes with thorns coming out radially on the trunk, but you won't see that on the branches. You won't see branched thorns. I mentioned the variability in the leaves. They have literally hundreds of species with variation and a lot of overlap, and then they're hybridized. That doesn't make life any easier. So that's complicating. But even on the same tree, those two leaves on the left side, I think that may be a Washington hawthorn, kind of an arrow-shaped leaf, but those two leaves came from the same branch of the same tree. So there's a lot of variability in the hawthorns. But you see those long unbranched thorns, that's all you need. I mentioned they're eaten a lot. This is from a Mexican food store here in Columbus. You can buy hawthorns in bottles and frozen in the form of candy. They taste like apple fruit roll-ups. And those are a couple of the haws, a couple of the fruits there between my fingers, still on a tree. Notice that the sepal, that's the thing there at the bottom. Well, actually, I think that's the calyx. I'm not a botanist. I don't have all the proper terms. But that's like the calyx on the bottom of an apple. If you look carefully on an apple, you may be able to count those 5 points. They're all in the rose family. And most, I think, all of the things in the rose family are edible. And they have those 5-pointed calyces that come out of the bottom. Look at a rose hip, look at an apple, you see the 5 points. Very typical of things in the rose family. It's a big family. There's a guy with big wicked thorns, but they branch out. In fact, the Latin name reflects that. The Latin name is Gladitia tricanthos, which is 3 thorns, 3 points. And that's where you get the branched wild wicked thorns sticking right out of the trunk, branches on branches, really wicked. Honey locust is an interesting guy. The leaves are interesting, but that's another talk. They have an edible fruit, sort of. Those are the big, long seed pods on the left. They get to a foot, sometimes even 2 feet long. They might be twisted a little bit. They look quite a bit like in terms of size, they're like a banana sliced lengthwise. They actually have an edible paste inside of them. It's nothing to write home about, but back in the day, before you could get online and order candy delivered to your door, people really relished sugar. They couldn't get much of it. If you break these seed pods open when they're first fall from the tree, when they're ripe, there's a green paste in between the hard beans. To me, tastes something like a sweet green bean. So it's okay, I guess, if you didn't have any other sweets. The reason they have those big branch thorns is probably to prevent too much foraging, especially during the Ice Age. We had large Ice Age mammals that would get up on these things and strip the trees of the fruits for the first 10 feet or however high they could reach. So these big branched thorns would defend them. Now, just like the sycamore, the city trees are not the same as the forest trees. We have hybrids, they're not hybrids actually, but we have a strain of honey locusts that we grow in the city that don't have thorns. I don't know if this explains all of them, but at least some of the honey locusts came from a tree in Kentucky. Somebody noticed, wow, this is a honey locust, but it doesn't have these big branch thorns, and it doesn't have any seed pods. So this would be great for landscaping. So how do they get more of them if they don't have seed pods? Well, you take cuttings. You cut off a twig and then you put it in a solution. At least now you do. You put it in a solution, causes roots to form, and then you can plant that and you have a tree and you take cuttings of cuttings of cuttings, and that's how you propagate them. What you'll recognize in the winter in the city, since the trees don't have the thorns, they don't have the seed pods, they have this bark, sometimes looks something like shag bark, but again, these narrow strips of bark lift up at the edges, not at the top and bottom. So that's typical honey locust. But the city trees typically won't have thorns and pods. In the woods, they'll have lots of thorns and pods. So that's honey locust. It's a really hard wood and interesting stuff. And that brings me to the final tree, the black locust. Black locust is kind of interesting. I don't know offhand if it's considered in some books anyway to be native to Ohio. It's definitely native to the US. It's native to the Appalachians. We're kind of on the western edge of it, but it's aggressive. It's used sometimes for reclaiming soil, strip mines and that kind of thing, but it can be a little too aggressive and some people don't like it. It has thorns too, but they're very different. They grow in pairs, usually about 90 degrees apart. And if you're looking at a tall tree, you may not see any thorns. You'll find them on the shoots and at the end of the young twigs. These rose-looking thorns, they get up to about an inch long. They're really sharp, and they come out at about 90-degree angles from the twig. And that's right at the base of the leaf in the summer. You see the leaves there on the right, compound leaves, like a stretched out penny, leaflets on a longer stem, making them a compound leaf. Seed pods there look something like a green bean. There's nothing edible in those that I know of, but they're related to tamarind, which maybe you've eaten tamarind candy. Again, is popular in Central America and Southeast Asian food. Tamarind candy, tamarind this and that. And like the honey locust, tamarind comes from the paste in between the hard seeds. Typical black locust bark. Once again, I mentioned the diamond bark, but this is the coarsest diamond bark of any. It's these diamonds are maybe a foot or 2 feet long. It often has kind of an orangish color, and it's a very good wood, but unfortunately, it's kind of odd because black locust wood is dark, and like a lot of dark woods I mentioned, it's rot resistant. They used to like to make fence posts out of it because it would last forever. It wouldn't rot, even down in the ground. It's a nice hard wood, takes a good polish, not a lot of porosity to it. But while it's alive, a lot of things like to eat it. And so you'll also often be able to pick it out because it has these fungi growing out of it. It's not the only tree, and they don't all have it, but 90% of the time I see these kind of shelf fungi on a tree, it's going to be a black locust. So the black locust, again, on the young twigs, the paired thorns, it's got the big diamondy bark, often orange color, and frequently the fungi, the shelf fungi coming out of it. So that's how I recognize black locust in the winter. And so that's it. That's 18 Ohio trees. Are
All
there any
right.
questions?
Thank you very much, Mort. There might have been some questions. I just realized almost all the way through that my personal computer here was the volume was off. So if anyone else was talking, we didn't hear, but the volume is up now.
Have at it.
And we should be able to hear folks. So if you'd like, you can unmute your mic, ask a question. I'll just take a look here in the chat too, which I have not been looking at.
Oh yeah, looks like a bunch.
And even a
I had a
couple people
question
in the,
about the pin oak.
Yeah.
The pin oak, I've always noticed when I've been collecting acorns that the pin oaks, because they're so small and sharp,
Yeah.
I've been able to identify the acorns by how sharp the pins are at the bottom. Does that have anything to do
That
with
is
why they were
character.
named pin oak?
That is character. Well, no. Well, you never know about names like that, just like place names. They have all kinds of odd stuff.
Mhm.
The explanation I've heard for the name pin oak is that it's one of the harder oaks, but it tends not to be it tends to have a lot of knots. So it wasn't real good for construction, but it made great dowels. You know, back in the day, they didn't hold buildings together with nails. They held them together with dowels, which they called pins. And
or
because
can
it
I
was
go
very,
back to the tree?
yeah,
Is-
yeah,
okay,
yeah, yeah, good
I'll look
idea.
for it.
Good idea. It's, yeah, real close to the beginning. In fact, the cover page is a pin out. Yep. Oh, you went past it. One more. There, that's a pin oak in the middle, and the leaf there is the lower left. So because the wood was very hard and it didn't tend to be good for construction because of the knots, in between the knots, you could make a nice hard dowel to pin together your beams. And so that's what I heard about pin oak.
Interesting. Thank you.
Ah, you're welcome. It is again, it tends to have these smooth ridges like this. It's got the hourglass shape. It's the skinniest of the pointed leaves in this part of the world. There are another couple of skinny leaves that look similar to it. That would be the scarlet oak and the shimmered oak. A little bit different, but the pin oak has, as you mentioned, unusually small acorns. The
Mhm.
northern red oak, which is the upper leaf there, is kind of intermediate fatness. The black oak is real variable, but it can get really fat and has hardly any low spot, hardly any sinus in between the lobes. But the red oak is intermediate width, but it's got the largest of the red oak acorns. The cap on that guy is about the size of a quarter, even bigger. It's very shallow, like a frisbee, and the acorn is the size of the end of my thumb. So some of these traits, again, it's all red oak or it's all white oak at the lumber yard. If you can't tell a species apart, it's not the end of the world. But if you want to know, you may not be able to tell exactly species on any given day of the year. You might need to see the acorns. And so that's part of the year. And I didn't mention, but it's not even necessarily every year. The acorns have a way of tricking squirrels and the likes. They have mast years, and the hickories and various other trees have mast years as well. But a mast crop, when they have a good year, they have a bumper crop of acorns. That's a mast year. They'll have some years where there are no acorns at all, and that keeps the squirrel populations at bay. If they had a steady crop, they'd have a steady batch of squirrels gobbling up all the acorns. But by having years where they're extremely prolific and then having a starvation year in between, then the years where they're prolific, in the mast years, the acorns have a chance of not being eaten or maybe being buried and forgotten and turning into an oak tree. Any other questions?
Here's one. Are there any other ways besides the leaflet number and nut size to tell the difference between shagbark and shellbark hickories?
Um, yeah, there's only one other way I know. Well, the nut size and the leaf. The only other way I know is by the shagginess, and it's not very dependable. They overlap. And I mentioned that people might be mistaking them. They're both shaggy, but the shagbark is more shaggy. Shellbark is less shaggy. So sometimes I get it right, sometimes I probably don't. That's the only other way I know. There may be a difference in the leaf scars, but I'm not sure what that would be.
Any other questions from folks? That's all that I see.
I have one.
Go
Okay.
ahead.
I would really like to tap some trees, but I don't have a sugar maple on my property. I was going to ask neighbors, but I also was just curious whether there are certain trees that are good candidates for tapping and that maybe have like different qualities that might not be necessarily super sugary, but maybe have like been used because of their flavor or mineral content or something like that.
I can't tell you about the mineral content. There are other trees that were commonly tapped, including some of the birches. Sweet birch, except unfortunately, sweet birch is more of a southern Ohio tree. It's not terribly likely you have one, but that's where wintergreen flavor came from. And then if it fermented, that's where birch beer used to come from. You can tap any of the maples, including you might have box elders. They're not a popular street tree because they're relatively weak. But if you have a wooded lot, you may well have a box elder, which is a maple. And I didn't talk about that. I could only show so many. But the box elder is a maple with leaves, usually 3, sometimes groups of 5 compound leaves, look nothing like the Canadian flag. But the way you can recognize that in winter is that it has green twigs. 2 trees in Ohio have green twigs. One is the box elder, a type of maple. The other is a sassafras. But the box elder, because it's in the madbuck group, maple, ash, dogwood, buckeye, will have distinctly opposite twigs. The sassafras, which are a lot less common, have alternate twigs. So if you have green twigs that are opposite, it's probably a box elder. Go for it. Good chance you've got one if you have a wooded area, not necessarily a street tree. There are other trees that they tapped for sugar, but I can't remember offhand what they are, the top of my head. But there are well, hickory. I think they, as I recall, they tapped hickory. So you might try that. But it's not the most common street tree either. Do you know what you have?
I have my neighbor has a pin oak, and I think they might be willing to let me tap it. And I have a red oak, but I don't know if the diameter is large enough to tap. But I do have hickory out front, but it's still pretty small.
Well, hickory, I believe they did tap. I'm pretty sure they did. Oak, I think, would be rather bitter, but I think you should try it and see what it tastes like.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I have another neighbor who has a sweet gum tree, and I was like, well, it says sweet in the name.
yeah. Well, yeah, and the Latin name, liquid amber.
Hmm.
We used to chew it like gum.
Oh,
And
interesting.
I don't know if they ever drank it. I won't, don't hold me to that. You might better check that before you put it in your mouth, but I think they
Thank
did.
you.
Sure.
Any other, one question was about the slides and the recording. So we'll review that. I gave our other speaker as well the option to do what she's the presenter that time and Mort's the presenter this time. Folks are wanting the slides and to know when the recording will be ready, but how do you feel about that? Or, I mean, you've
Yeah, I'm okay with that, sure.
okay. So we'll send that out. And give us a minute. We're all volunteers here. I think that's it. Thank you everyone for coming. I hope you had a great time and learned a little bit about how to identify trees in winter with Mort Schmidt. Thank
All
you.
right.
Thank you, Mort.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Thank you.
Welcome. All right. There we go.